Hi, my name is Madison Wolfe, and I'm going to be presenting on the psychological theory of learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is the theory that an organism that is repeatedly submitted to an inescapable aversive stimuli will learn to suppress future behavior due to the perceived non-contingency between behaviors and outcomes. In simpler terms, this means that an organism over time will learn that their behaviors have no effect on the outcomes or results of a situation, and they stop trying in the future. Therefore, they believe that no matter what they do, it doesn't make a difference. So they just stop trying. This was first discovered by Seligman and Meyer in 1967, and it was discovered on accident. They were doing an experiment with dogs and attempting to understand the effect of fear conditioning. They were trying to associate a tone with a shock stimulus. In this case, in the first learning trial, they were put in a container where they were not able to escape, and nothing they did had any result on the outcome of the situation, and they were shocked regardless of whether they attempted to escape or regardless of their behavior. Therefore, in the future trial, when they were given the opportunity to escape, the dogs did not escape in the future. This is due to the fact that they had learned that in the previous trial that no matter what they did or no matter what actions they had, there was no escaping this aversive stimuli, aka the shock. Therefore, even when given the ability to escape, they believed that even if they tried to escape, they still wouldn't be able to avoid it, so they waited out the shock instead. In 1986, Fincham and Kane discovered that in humans there's a 5-part model to learned helplessness, versus in animals it had been previously decided that there had been a 3-part model. So in humans there's 5 parts because of our higher cognition, and the first part of this model is the behavioral non-contingency. This is just the stage where the behavior is not lining up with the results. This could be in the case of if you had studied really hard for a test and you got an F on it anyway. Your behavior of studying is not lining up with the result of getting an F. The next stage of this model is the perceived non-contingency stage. This stage is where you recognize that your behavior is not lining up with the results. This is where you say, hey, I studied really hard, why did I still get an F anyway? This is when you start questioning why there's a non-contingency between them. The next stage in this 5-part model is the attributed non-contingency stage. This is where you attribute that non-contingency between behavior and results to some factor, whether that's an external factor, like your teacher wrote the test badly and worded it incorrectly, or your teacher graded your test wrong. These are external factors. Or it could be an internal factor of, I don't have the intellectual capacity to do well on these exams. I am not smart enough to perform well in this class. This is a pivotal place in this 5-part model because this can determine whether you believe that this non-contingency is going to be a stable factor or whether you think that it's going to be an unstable one that's only specific to this situation. The next stage is the perceived future non-contingency. This is where you decide, is this a stable problem that's going to continue to be a problem and it's futile, or is this a very specific problem that is specific to this scenario only? With the instance of the teacher grading the test incorrectly, this is more of a specific problem and it can be solved. Versus if you just don't have the intellectual capacity to do well on future tests, then maybe that's not a solvable scenario and it's going to continue to be a problem. Therefore, the second scenario is the one that's going to result in repressed behavior. You believe that there's no purpose in trying anymore because no matter what, you don't have that intellectual capacity to do well on these tests, so why try? This is what learned helplessness is. You've learned that no matter what your behavior is, you no longer have the capacity to do well in this class. So why try anymore? And you accept the bad grade and accept being a failure, and you don't study in the future. So there are 2 types of learned helplessness, and I kind of touched on them in the last slide. They are the outcome-based futility and the self-efficacy-based futility. Outcome-based futility is when you blame it on some external stimuli. This external stimuli, like I said, was the teacher was the one that wrote the test incorrectly. It's an external stimuli, but it's still one that's going to be stable over time. The teacher's writing every one of your tests, so it's still a problem that's going to progress and stay a problem in the future. The self-efficacy-based futility is the one where you say, I'm just not smart enough to do well in this test or to do well in this class. this is still a stable problem, but it's more an internal-based stable problem. There are both versions of learned helplessness, just one blames some external stimuli versus one blames your own self. But either way, they are stable stimuli, and that's what makes it unique to learned helplessness versus this just being a scenario that you can move on from and learn from and do better next time. It has been shown in rat versions of learned helplessness that they can be predisposed to learned helplessness genetically. And so Shimaki et al. In 2013 wanted to see if there was commonalities between these rats that were predisposed for the condition versus rats that were not predisposed to this condition. And they realized that there is a reduced sensitivity to reward, an increased drive to explore novel environments, and an increased propensity to form and maintain fear-associated memories. The first and third point in this line up very well with the model of learned helplessness. The reduced sensitivity to reward lines up with the fact that with learned helplessness, you're less likely to understand, hey, this is escapable now, and see the positive results in future experiences and instead hold on to that negative. Again, aligns with the third point that they have an increased ability to form and maintain fear-associated memories. So they're going to form those strong memories of the fact that they couldn't escape, and then they're going to hold on to that in the future. And even when they have been given an escapable circumstance, they're going to perceive it as inescapable. The second point is kind of confusing to me, and I would really like to look into it further, that they have an increased drive to explore novel environments. I'm not really sure how this plays into the learned helplessness model, but it is an interesting fact that they share that in common. In these studies, the Schulz et al. Study in 2010 also found that those predisposed to learned helplessness could be helped with Deprenyl, which is a MAOB inhibitor. Basically, by taking this drug, it lowered their helplessness in rats, but the helplessness reversal required experience of repeated test trials that were reminding them of the learning process. So therefore, this shows for the future that for those predisposed to the condition, once the condition is onset, it doesn't really help to take the medicine. The medicine is only helpful to reduce this initial predisposition, but the helpful thing to reverse this process is to repeatedly go through behavioral experiences that show successful behavioral contingency with results. It was shown in a study by Finkelstein and Ramey in 1977 that even infants fall prey to this. It's not a fully developed adult only scenario. That they did multiple experiments with infants and a mobile above their crib, and that those that got to control that mobile actually had an easier time in later trials learning that their actions had an effect on a situation than those that had no control over the results of how their mobile moved or didn't move. So next I want to go on to explain some real life scenarios where I've seen learned helplessness happen, and this is really evident in the American education system, this especially with children with learning deficits in schools. So children with learning deficits they try really hard before they're diagnosed with this learning deficit, and then they work really hard and they study really hard, and then they still end up getting bad results on tests. And this defeats them, and they tend to have this learned helplessness problem where they believe that nothing they do is going to make any difference. So they're attributing this failure as some internal unstable problem, which is their low ability. They have no intellectual ability to have success in this class in future scenarios. So even once they've been diagnosed and they've gotten the help, a lot of times they struggle with getting over the hump of learned helplessness, where they believe that now that they've been diagnosed, they're going to be able to learn and be successful. And they fall into this endless cycle of learned helplessness where they fail, and every time they fail, it makes them believe even harder that they are a failure and that this is due to some internal problem. This also is really evident in the American education system from the transition from high school to college. So only 30% of college and university students drop out after their first year, and half never graduate at all. And a lot of this is due to the fact that high school students are conditioned to believe that all tests are these factual multiple choice tests, because in schools we are taught to memorize information and spit it out on a test for like standardized testing purposes, because this is how like they gauge how well your school is against other schools in the country. So that's how we are taught in high schools, and we're not really taught how to reasonably deduce and problem solve. So because we're not taught any of this, when we move on to college, where these are the main conditions of how we're learning, a lot of people don't know how to learn, and they don't know how to study in order to be successful in college. And they believe, oh, I got A's in high school, why am I not getting A's now, and I'm studying the exact same way I did in high school. And this leads to this cycle of, okay, if I'm not getting A's now, doing the exact same thing I did in high school, maybe college just isn't right for me. They decide, I'm doing as much as I possibly can and I'm still not getting results. So they drop out of college and decide that this is a futile argument and futile battle that they're never going to win. So this is also seen in a very dark subject in kidnapping victims. So kidnapping victims that have escaped and later been found have said that they have been given multiple opportunities to escape, like where a door has been left open or something like that, but they never attempted. And this could be due to learned helplessness in a lot of them, because a lot of victims have been taught by their abuser and conditioned by their abuser that nothing they do matters, and none of the things that they do will keep them from being abused in this scenario. So when initial abuse is happening, screaming isn't doing anything. They're not able to escape any of these scenarios. So they believe that nothing they do is going to let them escape, so they don't even try when given this opportunity. So in conclusion, learned helplessness is the perceived lack of control over personal outcomes. And it can be due to both genetics and experience. Without the experience, it doesn't happen, but genetics can make you more susceptible to this phenomenon, and makes it easier to fall into this habit of learned helplessness rather than being able to move on from this very specific scenario and learn from it and act differently in the future. Treatment can require both a behavioral component and can require a medical one. So if you are predisposed to the condition, a medical intervention could be necessary to help reduce this predisposition so that you don't have to live with this for your whole life. But overall, the behavioral component is the biggest piece, and learning to rehearse these futile scenarios in ways that are successful is a way that you can learn to override this connection you've made in your brain that it is a futile situation. Overall, with lack of understanding and lack of action, learned helplessness can be detrimental in scenarios like kidnappings and things of that nature. So therefore, education is a really crucial step in reducing and eliminating its effects. So teaching this in schools and teaching people how to override these systems in your brain, how to really logically think through in that attributing non-contingency stage, to attribute it to things that are more specific and unstable, rather than things that are stable and global and huge problems that are going to last forever. Teaching students that not everything is going to be a consistent problem, and teaching them how to cope with that is huge in reducing and eliminating its effects. And here is the works cited. I had a lot of sources that contributed to this PowerPoint, so if you would like to reference any of those sources and see where I got my information, here they are. And thank you for listening.